I'm told that the government will get to this kind of big picture question next year once we've regulated the sector. But government have been saying since around 2017, and we're almost 10 years down the road, and not there yet. It's Joseph Musgrave. I'm the CEO of Home and Community Care Ireland. We are a representative body representing 46 independent home care providers with around 30 to 35,000 people getting home care services and probably around 15,000 carers.
Those numbers really do touch upon the fact that home support is one of those areas that nearly every citizen on the island has an experience of. So I've some personal experience of the services, but rather than me trying to interpret it from the outside, from your perspective, how would you characterise what's happening in the home support sector in Ireland right now?
So I guess there's kind of two main, there's the kind of current activity and then the reform programme. So home support is really divided into three broad areas. The biggest level of service is older people. Around 7% of people over 65 in this country get the home care service. And that will be help with going to the toilet, showering. It'll also be medication prompting. Then we have, and that's around 65,000 people get that service. And then around 8,000 disabled people, around 1% of the disabled population gets a home support service as well. And a very similar type of service, but often involving nurse-led care as well, stoma bags and spinal injuries and other kind of things. And then a much smaller number of pediatric home care packages are given to children with very high needs. It's almost always a nurse-led service. So on a day-to-day basis, that's what's happening. Probably around 30 plus million home care hours being delivered across the state in any given year right now. The other thing that's happening is this big reform program. I've been CEO for 8 years, and in that time, we have introduced a new national scheme for home care, which changed it from a competitive system based on whoever bid the lowest was rated the highest in terms of getting the work, to a national scheme, a national fixed price scheme for home support, which kind of took that out of it. But at the same time, it boosted the terms and conditions for carers. It said that they should be paid for travel time, they should be paid the living wage as a minimum. We're just about to regulate the sector for the very first time. The bill's going through the Oireachtas as we speak, and we might get to it. There are further reforms, hopefully, in the offing.
Would you describe as a follow-up question, would you describe the sector as being on the maturity curve? Are we about a quarter of the way there, halfway there, 75% there? Like, what's your kind of view on the maturity of the sector here?
I'd say we're probably a third of the way. We have a commitment to it. We're doing a lot of good work on a day-to-day basis. Where we need to do a lot more work, two main areas which would kind of take us up to almost 100%. One is on the workforce. We have never had in Ireland a social care workforce strategy, which sounds abstract, but really that is to say, how many workers do we need in home care? How are we going to look after them? What does their career look like? My youngest brother was a carer, left the sector because he had no career prospects. And often you can get to a certain point as a carer and your choice is then either to go to the back office or to graduate out of home care, become a nurse and go to a hospital setting. So we've got a lot of work to do in the workforce, and I get messages from carers quite often about issues they're having. And then I think on the kind of the human facing side of home care, which is to say, what am I entitled to? When can I get what I'm entitled to? And how is this all going to be affordable as we age as a country? We haven't done that work yet. It's meant to be happening. And I'm told that the government will get to this kind of big picture question next year once we've regulated the sector. But government have been saying since around 2017 that they'll be getting to this big picture question. We're almost 10 years down the road and not there yet.
I'm hearing the word regulation from you, and just in terms of, can you describe, I suppose, well, number one, silly question, who's going to be the regulator?
HIQA.
HIQA, okay. And do you think they have put in place with the legislation going through, do you see it being I suppose, ready when the regulation is passed, or do you think there'll be a bit of a phased process while the licensing and regulation policies are, I suppose, bedded down? Like, how quickly do you think it will actually hit the ground?
I think it'll be 2 to 3 years before we're in a situation where HIQA are fully auditing and inspecting and doing that job. I think there's a journey for 2 to 3 years where it's getting the sector to compliance. That work has begun at many of our members. They've started to anticipate what they think the regulation will say. We have quite a good idea now of what it will say. So that work is kind of ongoing with many providers, but until it's passed and it's, okay, here's the actual policy. Because what happens is once the bill is passed, the minister, in this case, Kieran O'Donnell, a Limerick man, he's the one that writes the actual regulations, called a ministerial order. So there's a bill, but then he writes the actual regulations. Well, obviously he doesn't sit down and write them with pen and paper, but you know what I'm saying. So once we get that package of stuff, the bill, then the regulations, followed by ministerial order, which should all happen hopefully this year, we will then know, okay, this is what we're expected to do. And then HIQA have said to us, it'll be around a 2.5 or so year journey to get the sector up to compliance before we're like, okay, now it's fully game on.
That regulation, did that foresee, I suppose, the existing model of delivering home care continuing and growing, in that this is a sector that it's not going to reduce, it's actually going to grow? Is that kind of one of the principles behind the regulation?
The regulations themselves are a lot more to do with how do we put this on a kind of regular footing, which is to say, how do we make sure that providers are of good quality and have the governance processes in place, because governance is so important to home care. Because so much of it happens in private homes, we're not really talking about an inspection regime where you've got a fleet of inspectors going out to watch carers do the job in someone's home. So a lot of it is going to be focused on the head offices and the offices of members of HCCI and other providers. Do they have the governance in place? And can we see evidence that's being applied by their workforce in the field? The regulation, its job is to do that more than what you're talking about. Now, the standards, this is an often confused thing. There are two kind of layers to regulation. There's the bill and the regulations we just talked about. And then HIQA have what they call their standards, which are often confused for being the regulation, but they're actually not. HIQA views its job, and I think there's a genuine debate can be had about whether this should be their job, but HIQA currently view their job to increase the quality of the service in any given area. And they view that job can never be complete. So I have an intellectual problem with that, but they think it can never be complete and they should always drive standards higher and higher and higher.
Cool.
So I've gotten into a discussion with HIQA because the standards that they have drafted, which aren't yet published, but I saw the last draft 2 years ago. So once the bill and the regulations are published, HIQA will then publish their standards. And the aim of the standards under their HIQA's own kind of framework and theory of change is to drive the sector to improvement. Now, in some areas, I agree with them off the bat. In other areas, it could be difficult and would require the way we currently commission home care, which is to say, right now, it's a very prescriptive system saying that this person X, requires these tasks to be completed in this time. The HIQA standards are much more framed in terms of what does the client want on a given day, rather than what is prescribed for them in a given day. And that's a fundamental tension that will have to be resolved that currently is not resolved in anything that we have seen so far.
You've described very clearly, I suppose, the role that HIQA are taking, particularly in applying the standards. And I suppose you're a new sector for them to start to review and govern. You mentioned earlier on regarding, your own family member who had worked as a carer. Can we touch upon some of the underlying challenges in the sector? Things like funding, workforce and access. What do you think we're doing really well at the moment in the home support sector in Ireland? And then where do you think there's room for improvement?
On a day-to-day basis, most people when asked are happy with the home care service they get. And I think that's a real testament to the carers that are doing work
Absolutely.
Day in, day out. Another thing I think that we do well, in some cases despite the system, is I was with a disabled person. We were in the Oireachtas together last week talking about the disabled home care system. And Leanne, the client I was with, she talked about how during Storm Éowyn, she was put in touch with emergency respite. Her power went out for several days. And her carer was the one that said, I think you're entitled to emergency respite. And so Leanne got a bed for a few days, rode out the storm. Stuff like that happens day in, day out. We do that very well. Where I think there's room for improvement is on the carer side of the ledger. There are some latent things that we could do quite quickly to make life better for carers. One is to pay them mileage. Right now, most HCCI members pay mileage, but that's not part of the home care scheme I talked about. The HSE don't pay for mileage, and they really should. It's a cost of doing business and cost of providing care. Another thing is carers don't get paid unless they do the work. So I actually had to go into battle with the HSE during the fuel protests because many carers couldn't get past the blockades. Therefore, they couldn't do their home care call, therefore they weren't going to get paid. And I said, that's not right. It's not through no fault of their own. We shouldn't have to fight as a sector every time something like that happens to make sure carers get paid. And then on the other side of the house, which is more the client side, I think it can be very, and I know this for a fact because I get calls about it from various people, when they first touch the home care system, they're often confused about how it works and how to make it work. And we could do a lot better in explaining how the system works and how to navigate it. Even without any reform to actually how you access it, I think a lot could be done to explain better how to access it. We try on the HCCI website to explain how you can access it and what you're entitled to, but it's not an easy system to understand. And in fact, there's a poll in the UK, and it said that those in the social care system actually understand it less than people not in the system, because once you get in it, it's so complicated that many clients get more confused than before because they think they understand it before and they get in and they're like, wait, what is this? How does this work?
Well, do you think there's a characterization of colleagues who work in the sector that perhaps it's a gig economy? Just listening to some of the challenges you mentioned there, that, well, look, if you can't get to the place of work, you're not paid for having worked, even though you've shown up, you've endeavored to get there, but you've been stopped. Like, do you believe that there's perhaps a perception that it's transitory labour force, it's a gig economy, and I suppose what's your views on that?
Yeah, I think a couple things that you touch on there, David. So one is, I think there's I was talking to someone from the HSE again early last week, and they were talking about how carers aren't paid for travel time. And I said, you're 3 years out of date. They are. So often people talk about respecting carers, but they're not keeping up with actually what the situation is on the ground. I'm not saying that the terms and conditions are where they should be. In fact, we need to do more. But you can't say you value what home carers do, but then not actually know how it works. And I think a lot of people do the first thing, we value them, but then actually don't do the second thing, which is make the effort to understand how it works. Also, I think there's a bit of intellectual snobbery, which no one admits to, which is that, that's for people that care. It's for people that aren't well educated. It's what they could find. I think that attitude, it's almost like this kind of discrimination that's kind of never really talked about, but I think it's there. I've encountered carers who are on second careers, that used to work in law firms, that used to do all sorts of jobs, and now they've decided in this next phase of their life they want to care for someone in their community. They want to be helping to support their local area and the people that they care for in that area, in that town or whatever. And you find quite a few carers come to it later in life through that prism, very well educated, but they're more interested in caring than they are for the financial gain. And I think often that's not given enough credence either.
Amid, I suppose, the legislation going through, the drive towards ever higher standards, the workforce challenges, you have so many agendas and aspects that your organization could focus on, and I'm sure it's a temptation to focus on all of them. So in terms of your strategy and what you're seeking to execute over the next 2 to 3 years, what specific endeavors and initiatives are your organization pushing for?
Yeah, it's a good question, and our chair is Frances Fitzgerald, the former Taoiseach, and she is big on making sure the team's resourced to do enough. She said often organizations like HCCI don't actually build the internal capacity to execute on all the things they need to, and she's dead right. So we've expanded the team, and we're going to have a couple areas of focus. I broadly do divide it into our policy and advocacy work and our member services work. So in our member services work, we've brought someone on board, Susan's a key member of my team, and she's leading on how do we make life easier for our members operationally? What things can we provide them? What advice can we do? But she's also helping lead up, are the regulations and then the standards, how do we meet those? Are they fit for purpose? What's a response to them? And what does then the future look like building on that piece of work? As well as providing a suite of member events. We've done events, various types to help our members prepare for regulation. We did a session recently on AI in the sector and what that will mean, etc., etc. So there's a big program of work there, which over the next 2 years will have a really sharp focus on regulation, milestones, etc., etc. I expect that to be the predominant section of work, and that'll have various complexions. There'll be governance issues, there'll be HR and workforce issues to be thinking about. On the policy and advocacy side, once the regulations come into or pass the Oireachtas, we've got to start thinking about 3 years into the future, where do we want policy to go? So a couple of areas we're focusing on there are on bringing disability home support up a level. It reminds me of when I first got this job, in that it's underfunded relative to the need. It's not well understood relative to the conditions of people that require the service. The budget for disabilities home care has only gone up by around 40 to 50% in the last 6 years. Older persons, 110%. So we've got a big job of work to do to make sure disabled people get the care they need. And then we've got to look at this future right to home care. What does it mean? Like, we have a right to nursing home care through the Fair Deal. We need something similar for home care. What does that look like? What is that? And we finally need to achieve it, because the government said in 2017 it was going to get it done. I think Helen McEntee was the first minister that publicly committed to having it done in her term of office. That didn't happen. And every minister since then, including the current one, Kieran O'Donnell, has said that they will deliver a kind of statutory right to home care. So we were going to really focus on that. I mean, we focused on it a lot over the years, but we've always been kind of going through a process of, well, we've got to get regulations done, we've got to get standards done, we have to reform the HSE. There's all these blockers, we're told, have to be unlocked before we get to actually giving people in the state, here's what you're entitled to and here's how we're paying for it.
It's always interesting when you hear about something that you feel is inevitable, and then you realize just how many steps you need to follow to make it happen. And I think you've described that. And in our pre-talk, you mentioned about, the age of the state. We're not 300 years old,
No.
So it's a case of, perhaps it's as the state matures and the machinery within it that we look to accelerate some things that you would describe as being inevitable and obvious and needing to happen, particularly in terms of the time lag with the Fair Deal scheme. Joseph, I'm going to conclude at that part, but I suppose, speaking from our perspective and the fact that I've engaged with a couple of members of your team, the respect with which you're held really does come across. And I'd say, from what I can see on LinkedIn, you're making a big impact in terms of publicising the topics that you're lobbying for and working very hard. So I think you're a good template of what a CEO in your sector should be doing. So congratulations on your work you're doing, and we'll continue to support you. So thanks very much, Joseph.
Thanks, David.